Well, with record snowfall still on the ground, it seemed like a good time to start thinking about summer vacation, right? And so Sherry and I were talking a little bit about that. Our daughter Zoe is going to serve at a Christian camp in upstate New York this summer, and so we thought, well, we can deliver her and then go, have a little vacation. So we thought, where do we want to go? And one of the things that came up was maybe Niagara Falls. Never thought about Niagara Falls, never been there. So I looked up a little bit. What can I learn about Niagara Falls? It's actually made up of 3 waterfalls, and you combine all of those, it has the highest flow rate of any waterfall on earth. That's 3,160 tons of water every second. Just this massive, powerful force. And I was thinking about Niagara Falls and just how big and awesome that must be, and reading a little history. In the 1800s, the only way to cross was by boat, and in 1847, they decided we need a bridge to cross this chasm, and so they commissioned this gentleman to start building a suspension bridge across Niagara Falls. Now, at the time, this engineering feat wasn't out of the ordinary. They had the science, the engineering, the means to build a bridge that long. The trick was going to be, how do you get started? How do you get the first cable across this 800-foot gorge with 225-foot cliffs on either side, all with rapids in the middle, leading to this massive, powerful waterfall? How do you get that first line across? And so they got a think tank together, and they started to ask, just brainstorm different ideas, and they heard things like a cannon to shoot it across. And one gentleman who sort of thought outside of the box said, what if we used kites? And we could just have a kite flying competition to find the best kite to fly that cord across the falls. And so that's what they did. They invited kids to come fly their kites across Niagara Falls. And in January of 1848, they had hundreds of kids come out and fly their kites. Nothing says kite flying weather, I imagine, like January at Niagara Falls. But that's what they had. Hundreds of kids come out, and eventually one of those kids, a young man by the name of Homan Walsh, flew his kite all the way across Niagara Falls on January 30 of 1848. And they made it across. And so what they did is they tied a little heavier kite line to that kite and flew it across. They tied a little heavier kite line to that kite and flew it across. They tied eventually a rope to that kite and flew it across. And then finally, they attached a cable consisting of 36 strands of 10-gauge wire and flew it across. And that was the first cable to the suspension bridge that they eventually built to cross Niagara Falls. Just this immense project. And sometimes when you face something, a project, a task that's so big, the real trick is sort of figuring out, how do we get started? Where do we begin? And that was the trick for building that bridge across Niagara Falls. How do we get the first cord across safely? How do we do that? And sometimes in ministry, serving Jesus, I feel the same way. I know I want to help. I know I want to be of use. I know I want to make a difference. But how do you get started? We're going to study over the next several weeks a man in the Old Testament that we don't often look at, a book in the Old Testament that I don't think gets a lot of play, although maybe it should. We're going to take a look at Nehemiah, who's sort of the great rebuilder. If you think of Moses as the guy who led God's people out of Egypt, out of captivity, and kind of got the whole nation rolling kind of thing, well, Nehemiah comes along and he rebuilds it after the exile and after captivity. It's really an amazing story, and this morning we're going to dive in and see how he gets started. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them up to the book of Nehemiah. It's kind of in the middle of your Bible, all right? Just before you get to Psalms and Proverbs, you're going to find Nehemiah just before that, a little bit before that. We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 1. Just 11 verses here. We're going to read all 11 of those verses in Nehemiah chapter 1. This is what God's word says. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard those words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are faithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king. All right, so as we dive into the story of Nehemiah, I think there are 3 steps to sort of help us figure out where Nehemiah gets his start. Step number 1 is to start looking through the eyes of God. We need to start looking at people through the eyes of God. Now, in the first 3 verses here in Nehemiah chapter 1, we're just kind of introduced to the key players in our story. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now, it happened in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, I was in Susa of the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped and who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem, and they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. All right, and so we're introduced to Nehemiah. Nehemiah, what we know about Nehemiah is that first we can begin that his name means God comforts. He's the son of Hakaliah. We're introduced to his dad. I'm not sure why we learn his name other than maybe Nehemiah was glad that he wasn't named after his father. I mean, Hakaliah is sort of severe, isn't it? And so we get his dad's name, and I think we can also draw from this fact that probably we're introduced to a couple of people who have been born in captivity. That both Nehemiah and his father were probably born in the exile. It's been 140 years since the Babylonians have conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. If we go back, maybe we need just a little history lesson here, and we can take the history of God's people, we'll just condense it down. You go back to the beginning, and God creates everything, and eventually in the book of Genesis, we're introduced to Abraham. God promises Abraham, you're going to have a son, and through that son, I'm going to build a family, and through that family, I'm going to build a nation. And so from Abraham comes Isaac and then Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Those 12 sons end up, because of a famine in Egypt, where a lot of drama and history, they are reunited with their brother Joseph. And so that family grows and grows and grows into a nation of people in Egypt, to the point where the leaders who are in Egypt say, man, this is pretty scary. And so they make them slaves. And for years and years and years, The Hebrews were slaves in Egypt until finally God raises up Moses. Moses leads God's people out of slavery in Egypt. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Joshua leads them into the promised land. They conquer the promised land. You enter into this sort of time in history in Israel with the judges. You got to read through the book of Judges sometimes. It's crazy. You can summarize the book of Judges just by saying the people did whatever they wanted. And that's kind of what happened there until finally God brings them, allows them to have a king, and King Saul is risen up, and then King David comes into place, and his son Solomon builds a temple in Jerusalem. And then we get to this sort of civil war in the history of Israel and the northern kingdom and southern kingdoms. Eventually Assyria comes in and wipes out the northern kingdom, carries them into captivity. Finally Babylon comes in, destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, carries that first group of folks into exile from Judah, the southern kingdom. If you read the book of Daniel, Daniel the prophet was a part of that first exile there, and so they're carried off. Eventually the Babylonians are overthrown by the Persians while God's people are still in exile. The Persians kind of rule differently than the Babylonians. The Persians kind of weigh down people with taxes rather than military force, and so King Cyrus decides we can send people back to their homelands, and so folks from exile start to return to Jerusalem, and it's at that point that the temple is eventually rebuilt in Jerusalem. But the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem was 70 years before we read these words, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. So Nehemiah and Hakaliah, his whole family, were probably born in exile. It's very likely that Nehemiah has never, ever seen Jerusalem. He grew up hearing those stories. He grew up hearing the stories of the dynasty of King David and the temple built by Solomon. And he remembers well the punishment from disobedience. We'll read that in his prayer. But he's never been to Jerusalem. And he's living in Susa. It's a winter palace of the king of Persia because he is cupbearer to the king, we learn in verse 11, right? Nehemiah had this high position of influence and affluence in the kingdom of Persia, lived his whole life there. And finally, his brother Hanani, in verse 2, returns from Jerusalem. We have no idea if Hanani had gone home to live in Jerusalem or if he was just sent on a special expedition to kind of figure out how things were in Jerusalem. But in any event, he's made this 1,000-mile journey between Susa and Jerusalem, and he comes back with word for Nehemiah. Nehemiah asks, what's it like in Jerusalem? And it's not good news. Verse 3, and they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. I just want you to sort of compare, I guess, the characters that we've met so far in this story. Nehemiah has this high position. He's cupbearer to the king. And the cupbearer to the king, there's a couple sort of simple ways to explain that job. And essentially the job was he tasted the wine and the food that was presented to the king to make sure, they let the cupbearer eat and drink. And then in half an hour, if he wasn't dead, the king went ahead and had supper. All right, so that's sort of the basic idea. But the position was sort of way more serious than that. You kind of really had to trust this guy who was determining if what you ate and drank was okay. And so the cupbearer to the king grew into this position of this trusted confidant to the king. It grew into a position of sort of this high-ranking official. If anybody wanted to get to the king, they kind of had to come through the cupbearer. He was the gatekeeper, not just of lunch for the king, but of everyone else as well. And so he has this really significant, important position in the kingdom. He was in Susa at that that time, this was the winter palace for the king of Persia. When you hear of somebody wintering somewhere, what do you kind of think of that person? Man, they sort of got it going on a little bit, right? They have this lifestyle of influence and affluence, and that was certainly true of Nehemiah. You compare that to the Jewish folks who were back in Jerusalem, who had either survived during the exile, their families had stayed there, or they had returned. And what you read is a city that was still in ruins. 70 years. That's the real sort of distressing part of this. For 70 years, they've had the opportunity to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and just nobody's taken that initiative to start, to get it going, to go through with that process. And so you have a city that is living in kind of constant threat of invasion, and their spirit is just as destroyed as the walls. And so I think maybe the most important words in the first 3 verses of Nehemiah chapter 1 is that, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped. Nehemiah, this guy who is living this life of influence and affluence, he asks about these folks who are kind of distressed and out of sorts back in what he still considers home, Jerusalem. We just need to start to think, how can we see folks through the eyes of God? Certainly, one of those ways we do that here at Wallula Christian Church, I just want to brag on you guys for a little bit, is by sharing resources. We just received our end of the year Christmas offering and this Walk to the Manger offering. We received a little over $37,000 that we'll share with Let Every Ear Hear in India. We've heard about how they're making a tremendous impact with all kinds of folks. We heard that story about sharing the television show The Chosen in different homes and different meeting places in the mountains, 30 degrees below zero. It kind of, we maybe can feel that a little bit this last week, but not quite still, right? And all so that the story of Jesus can be shared. Honduras Ministries will share some of that offering with Honduras Ministries as well. And we just heard from our friend Dave Coleman share a story about the church he attends in Honduras, just baptizing a bunch of folks a few weeks ago. Honduras Ministries making a difference, just allowing families to send their kids to school instead of working in the fields because they have enough food to eat, all so that they might hear the story of Jesus, and that is certainly getting through in those places. We'll share some of that Christmas offering with our helping ministry here at Wallula, and just meeting the basic needs of folks in our community. A Third Thursday ministry that feeds folks every third Thursday in downtown Leavenworth, hundreds and hundreds of spaghetti dinners served every third Thursday. It's awesome to be able to just meet some needs of folks and see them through the eyes of God. We can get started here even at Wallula. We heard in the announcement video that this week our kids ministry, our jam on Sunday evenings, and our student ministry, our youth groups get kicked off again. And I just want to encourage you, if you've been hearing kind of the Spirit whisper to you about serving in the kids ministry or student ministry, you need to talk to Katie or Zach about serving in that area. I used to talk to folks, inviting them to be youth coaches when I was a youth pastor, and we would always talk about the fact that, hey, we would love to have you, but you need to understand that you're really, we talked about those other missionaries. This is a cross-cultural mission into student ministry, into kids ministry, right? You don't have to think very hard to understand that, when you're sort of outside of those teenage years, just by a few years, it doesn't take long for you to be out of the loop, right? For that culture to kind of have moved on from you. And so just different ways that we can see people through the eyes of God and instead of through kind of our own selfish lens. Start looking through the eyes of God. Nehemiah asked about the remnant in Jerusalem. He was concerned about them. He was looking at them through the eyes of God. Step 2 is start looking for God with all that you are. Verse 4 says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And so we're just getting introduced. The next 5 verses are going to be Nehemiah's prayer, and we'll read through those in just a second. But I think there's some important things that we need to tackle here in verse 4. And just at the end, he said, I continue fasting and praying before the God of heaven. When you hear the word prayer, what comes to mind? What do you think about? I think probably most of us, we have some questions about that perhaps, and I think mostly we think about one certain kind of prayer that is maybe just most important to us. This author and preacher, John Mark Comer, talks about 4 different kinds of prayer. He talks about talking to God. He said that's when we pray sort of pre-made prayers. So if you ever recite the Lord's Prayer, that, according to Comer, would be talking to God. You're reciting a prayer that Jesus wrote. That's important, but he said, hey, pray like this. And so one of the ways we do this that I don't often think about in these terms is that when we sing together on Sunday mornings, we're really reciting together, we're singing together these prayers that somebody else has written in kind of this corporate fashion. And so talking to God might be reciting these pre-written or pre-made prayers. Talking with God is just having that conversation and kind of lifting up. These are my words, not Comer's, but lifting up the good, the bad, and the ugly in your life to God. And so when we talk with God, we would include things like, writing those prayer requests on the welcome home cards, that kind of asking God for help in our life is talking with Him. A third kind that Comer talks about is listening to God. It's spending time hearing from Him. And I think there's 3 kind of basic ways we hear from God: through His Word and through His Spirit and through His people, other believers. And so these gatherings are important, but we need to spend time hearing from God through His Word, through His Spirit, and through believers. And then being with God. It's just this being in the presence of God. I think about being in the presence of God like this. Have you ever taken a road trip? You've been in the car with somebody and you sat in the car and it's been silent for a long time. And there's kind of 2 different ways that can hit you, right? If you're in the car and it's silent for a long time and that relationship is it's broken a little bit, it's fragmented, it's not going great, then that silence can seem really, really awkward. If you're in that car and you're riding together in silence, in that relationship, you're in tune, it's a maturing, growing, intimate relationship, then that silence can be almost peaceful. That just hits you in a different way. And being in the presence of God, I think of as that long car ride with that person that you're in tune with, and you're okay just being quiet next to each other. And there are times when we just need to be still and quiet before God. And so 4 different kinds of prayer. I don't know if it's important as to which one of those prayers we do most or pray the most, but I just think we get back to the beginning of verse 4, and there are these 2 words that stand out as really important to me: as soon. It says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying. Nehemiah, as soon as he heard of trouble, as soon as he thought, man, how can I help? He sat down and he prayed. I'm not sure if it's so important that we balance our prayer life in these 4 kinds of prayers, or that we worry about moving from one form to another, as it is that we start praying, that we stop and we listen and we start talking to God. He stopped and he prayed. In 1879, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And it changed things. It sort of ushered in this age of technology. And one of the things that changed was sort of the amount of rest we got as Americans. Prior to 1879, Americans slept on average 10 hours a night. I think it's about 6 today. But it ushered in this wave of technology, and by the 60s, 1960s, we had air conditioning and all sorts of, this boom of technology. Folks in the United States were starting to study it. There was a Senate subcommittee that determined in 1967 that by 1985, Americans would work on average 22 hours a week, 27 weeks a year, because of the amount of leisure time that technology has provided. We're on the other side of 1985, and I would love to have a conversation with you if you're working 22 hours a week, 27 hours a year. Just how are you making that happen? That's a good thing. Time is a funny thing. Because we talk about time as this resource that we can never get back, and I think that's true. We talk about time as something that nobody seems to have enough of. I just wonder if that's a little bit of an excuse. I wonder if maybe all the different systems and tools and technology that we have that provide us with more time, it's just a question of what do we fill it back up with. And for Nehemiah here, when his first stop, the first thing he did when he heard about the situation in Jerusalem was that he stopped and prayed. I wonder what would happen if we started to fill that time back up with prayer instead of any number of things we can be about. Those two words, as soon, pretty important in verse 4. You go on and he says, I continued. I think those two words are pretty important too, because this wasn't a new habit for Nehemiah. He continued to pray. He kept going back to it over and over and over again. Those small groups that are starting up, one of the reasons those are so important is that they provide us with this opportunity on a weekly basis to stop one more time, to be in God's Word, and to spend time with other believers in prayer. And so it just gives us this opportunity. We need to continue to hear from God on an individual basis and as a small group and as a large body of believers, to continue to hear from God and start to seek Him with all that you are. Nehemiah stopped right away and he prayed. And he continues in this prayer in verse 5 through 10 and just these different aspects involved in this prayer. And I said, O Lord of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love Him and keep His commandments. That word awesome just means to fear or revere. And so Nehemiah begins by honoring his God, by just acknowledging that his God is a big, big God. Verse 6 says, let your ear be attentive to and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel which have sinned against you. Even I in my father's house have sinned. So confession is a part of Nehemiah's prayer. He begins by honoring God. He continues by confessing his sins. One of the important things that we ought to learn from this moment of confession for Nehemiah is that we like to confess other people's sins. You know, we might pray like Nehemiah, oh, your people have sinned against you, and especially that group over there or that group over there. But Nehemiah doesn't just do that, right? Nehemiah says, oh, my father's house, and even I have sinned against you. And so he confesses his sins to God. Confession ought to be a part of our prayers. Verse 7 says, we have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. And so Nehemiah just said, I know we have sinned, and the consequences for that have been exile, but you promised if we honor you, you'll bring us back, that you'll reunite us. And so Nehemiah asks for what he needs before God. That ought to be a part of our prayers. Verse 10, they are your servants and your people whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. Thanksgiving is a part kind of throughout this prayer. We ought to give thanks to God in our prayer as well. Just stop and pray like Nehemiah stopped and prayed. Continue to go back to him. Look for God with all that you are. Begin talking to him. Step number 3 is to start again. Do it all over. Look at verse 11 here. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. And so Nehemiah here, he kind of goes back. You look at the beginning of his prayer, and he asks for God to hear and to listen, and Nehemiah is back to doing that. This is the first of 9 prayers in the book of Nehemiah. I read a scholar who said, well, when you're reading the book of Nehemiah, you're reading Nehemiah's journal. And I would take that one step further. If we get 9 prayers in the course of 13 chapters, I think we're looking and kind of peeking into Nehemiah's prayer journal. And so just over and over and over again, Nehemiah goes to prayer. He just seeks God out with all that he is. Verse 11 ends, he's asking God. We're going to read about this conversation that Nehemiah has with the king Artaxerxes next week. And this is sort of the precursor to that conversation, this prayer, the ending of this prayer. He asks for help in that conversation. And Nehemiah ends verse 11 by saying, now I'm cupbearer to the king. And I think this ought to stand out for us because Nehemiah wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet. He didn't have any missionary experience. He wasn't a theologian. Nehemiah worked for this Persian king, this pagan ruler. He had a job in the government, kind of this everyday sort of position. And yet, Nehemiah is praying, God, use me in a big way. I want to make a difference. I want to serve you. I want to help others. And why was Nehemiah so confident in making that prayer and asking to be used by God? I think because he knew he kind of had this secret sauce of prayer. My family, Sherry and Zoe and I were out to eat with some friends and at this barbecue restaurant. And on the table there was this restaurant's regular barbecue sauce, and then there was the spicy barbecue sauce. And they said, well, you can try the spicy. Yeah, well, I'm going to try that because you can, if it's on the table, it's safe to eat. All right, that's pretty much been my experience. A while ago, I was eating with some other friends at this Mexican restaurant here in town. I've been there a ton of times. They said, have you ever tried the spicy salsa? I said, no, I didn't even know they had spicy salsa. And my friend said, well, you have to ask them for it. And this is when you have to pay attention, all right? There's a reason they keep stuff hidden in the back. And I said, yeah, bring it out. And I dipped in a chip, and they're just watching me with big smiles. I've got this big scoop of salsa, and man, my mouth exploded. Wow, that was hot. There's a reason it's hidden in back. You got to be careful with that stuff. Here's what I would say as a follower of Jesus, as someone who has this awesome opportunity to commune with the Creator, Sustainer, Redeemer of the universe, we have that secret sauce. We have the spicy salsa right at our hand. We can absolutely make a difference for God when we stay connected to Him. Just like Nehemiah, we ought to start praying to serve God in big ways. We can start praying to serve God in big ways, just like Nehemiah, knowing that we have access to that spicy salsa, knowing that we have the Creator of the universe behind us, knowing that when we're talking to God, we're talking to a God who created everything we see. When you think about the universe and how big it is, I read one author who said that if you decided that the Milky Way galaxy was the size of North America, all right? So we're just going to pretend that the Milky Way galaxy is the size of North America, then that means that our solar system, the sun and 8 planets or whatever. Are there 8 planets, 9 planets? I'm a preacher. That our solar system would fit in a coffee mug. That's how big. Think how big we consider our solar system, and it would fit in the coffee mug. that God created everything we see. NASA has the Voyager space vehicles that are going through the space, and they've been out for 40 years traveling at 35,000 miles per mile or whatever, and it takes, when they communicate, it takes 17 hours for data to get back and forth from Earth to these Voyager vehicles. And so scientists determined that if you sent a message at light speed, that it would take like 15 billion years to get to the end of the universe. God, the creator of the universe, we can have a conversation with him at any moment when we stop and talk with him. Now we can start praying that we could serve God in big ways. Maybe some of you have read a novel by John Grisham. He's a prominent author in the United States. He decided, he was a lawyer in a former life, and he decided that he wanted to be an author. He kind of hated his job, and he didn't know how to get started, though. So he tells this story that at the top of his calendar every day, he just wrote the word write. And so he went into work 60 minutes early every day and just started to write. And eventually he became this author that we know has written so many different books. His sort of dream came through all because he got started writing. My question is simply, what would happen if at the top of our calendar we wrote the word pray and just spent time, we stopped like Nehemiah and we prayed and we talked to God. Start praying to serve God in big ways. Let's stand and worship him.